Welcome. This is week 6 of Econ 202. So we are getting close to the end. We have 2 weeks only left. So what I'm going to do now, as usual, I'm going to show you what is due this week and talk about a couple of the important points. So here is the canvas for the course. And when you go to modules again, you will go to week 6. Again, this looks a bit different for you because this is the instructor's view, but it's similar. So some things you will not see them. This one, for example, is like this because it just started, but yeah, I think you see everything. Anyway, so when you go and look at learning materials, this week we do 2 chapters, chapters 11 and 12. They're important chapters, especially 12. 12 is important because it talks about another form of market failure, which is called monopoly. And monopoly is one of the most important ones. Last week we saw externalities. Externalities, very important because it affects other people outside of the transaction. And so it kind of interferes with the optimal outcome. And monopoly, pretty obvious. There's only one producer, so they can do with the price more what they want than in a competitive situation, which usually turns out to be bad for consumers, and that's why there are antitrust laws that exist. But there's also chapter 11. Chapter 11 talks about the market for factors of production, and that means the labor market, the market for machines, stuff like that, stuff that you use to make other things, okay? And so the labor market is the more important because it affects people, and the labor market works like any supply-demand markets. You will have suppliers, demanders, and as long as it's competitive, then the same type of analysis applies, and it's pretty straightforward. The articles you're going to read are 2 regarding chapter 11, 2 about minimum wage, basically. They're very interesting, and though they are dated, but they have very good points. And actually, the first one talks about the possibility, instead of a minimum wage, have something that is called the earned income tax credit, which would be, instead of, if you work full time, whatever the market wage is, the market wage, but then you would get, the government will give you back money instead of you paying taxes to reach a minimum amount that is consistent with whatever society considered to be the minimum level that a person should make. The last 2 are about monopoly, and they specifically talk about a specific market, which is diamonds. And if you don't know, diamonds is not anymore so much the case, but until a few years ago, it's very monopolistic. There was one company, a South African company, that controlled basically the entire market. And the price of diamond is so high, not because they're rare, but because it was kept artificially, limited the supply, so they kept the price artificially low, and also they built this marketing around diamonds that really made you think you need a diamond, say, to getting engaged. But in reality, diamonds are cool because they're very strong, the strongest material on earth, so very cool, but really they shouldn't be that valuable. There's a lot of diamonds. And the real use of diamonds is mostly to cut stuff because it's the hardest thing. So if you think about how do you cut steel on a steel mill, you have diamonds-based saws. They're saws with little diamonds, and that's how you cut steel. But now there are artificial diamonds, so it's a bit different story. But anyway, so these are the readings, and then there are the usual videos that talk about the same ideas of. There's actually a couple of the resource market, and then there are a couple of monopolies, and yeah, I suggest you watch them because they really make sense. They help you really understand the topic. Okay, so this is what's due for the readings. Then after you do the readings, you take the reading quiz, and this week you have a homework for chapter 11 and 12, and a chapter test is only on chapter 12. And then you have a monopoly discussion. Monopoly discussion, you take an example of a monopoly in real life and you discuss it. You can take diamonds, you can take medications when they have a patent. There are many examples of monopoly. You can take, like, for example, your water distribution. Usually there's only one in one town, and that's a monopoly. It's called a natural monopoly, and they're usually utilities and stuff like that. Okay, so that's what's due. Let's do Sunday, the discussion board. You're getting close, so if you're behind on my lab assignments, remember there's no makeup dates at the end. You need to be done by the end of next week, so complete all the my lab by next Sunday. Okay, now let's look at a couple of things. So for what it concerns the labor market, the main important thing is to understand this idea of value of marginal product of labor. And then what it means is, if I hire more workers, assuming I have this diminishing marginal returns of work, because in the short run, there are increasing inefficiency. After an initial increase in marginal return, you get the decreasing part, and that's the one that counts to establish how many people you will hire. But of course, if you hire an extra person, will cost some amount of money, will help you produce an extra amount of things, and so that's the value of the extra product, and that's diminishing because of diminishing marginal returns. And so the market wage, which is given by the market supply demand, so for one single firm, it's the market wage, right? Because you cannot pay people less, assuming the market are perfectly efficient. Then if you pay a person less, they'll go work for someone else, right? And if you pay somebody more, you're losing money because you could pay them less. You get to pay you can pay the market wage. And so in this case, as the market wage fluctuates, you can see that you will hire more or less people if the market wage goes up, more people if the market wage goes down. So that's basically the same thing for machines for capital, and you can read the book. There's a lot of cool examples, a lot of interesting stuff about it. For monopoly, it's also very important for the reasons that I said before. And the important thing about monopoly is that there are many. Sometimes firms do not own the entire market, but they are big enough, and there are certain aspects of the market that make it so that they have monopoly power. So you will see examples of market, although there are other competitors, but one is so big and dominant that kind of takes over, okay? And there are cases of pure monopolies. And so the reasons why monopolies exist, there are mainly two. One is the government gives you the right to be, like patents for medications, or the other one is called natural monopolies, which is based on efficiency, giving the economies of scale. The bigger you are, the cheaper you can produce. And so it's more efficient to have one company because of this diminishing marginal cost, continue diminishing. So that means that the bigger you are, the diminishing average total cost, they keep going down. And so you have better, more efficient production by one firm. And so because of that, it's better to have one producer. But in that case, if it's a monopoly, then especially in the case of utilities, then they can charge more and be negative for consumers. So that's why, for example, in Idaho, there is the Idaho Utility Commission. And the Utility Commission is a commission at the state level that the public utility, say water, electricity, they want to change their rates. They have to go through the commission. They have to prove that they have a reason for that. They cannot just increase rates willy-nilly, because it's deleterious for consumers, okay? But monopolies, once a monopoly is established, they have the same problem as any other firm. Was the ideal price I should charge and the quantity produced to maximize my profits, right? And so this has a social cost because it ends up being different almost all the time than the competitive outcome. And so there's all this thing about marginal cost and marginal revenue, how marginal revenue is different from a monopolist, because a monopolist controls the entire market. So the price is not fixed, given by the market, but it can be changed depending how much stuff they produced. And so that the marginal revenue differs than the demand, and is actually below that. And you want to read the book to understand exactly what it's about. But I'll show you the graph. The graph will look something like this. You will have a demand. The demand is faced by the monopolist. Because of the elasticity, changing elasticity and changing total revenues, then the marginal revenue will be below like this. Because up here, remember the price at a high price, low quantity, the demand is very, so notice how I changed the price a little bit. Excuse me. I changed the quantity a lot. So here is very elastic. Down here is very inelastic. And so down here, I want to raise the price, down here, decrease the price. And so that's why at this optimal point here, my total revenue will be maximized at this point here. Now, this is revenues. Now you want to find profits, right? Because the idea is I want to make the most profits, not the most revenue. And so once you insert costs, this analysis change a little bit. And so there are all the problems in the book that you can do. They're very interesting. But the main idea is this graph here. I'll show you another one after. But in this graph, you can see that you have here the demand, the marginal revenue for the monopoly. So there's only one monopolist. And this, assuming, is the marginal cost. And for simplicity, we assume it's fixed. Doesn't need to be fixed, but for simplicity of calculations, we'll assume that the result doesn't change. So notice that you have here marginal cost. Remember marginal revenue. Remember that you maximize profits always where marginal cost equals marginal revenue. So at this point here, but this is not on the demand curve. So when I make 100 units, I don't need to charge one. I can charge $3 for the 100 units that I make because that's what the demand will bear. So that means I have a profit of $2 per unit, and that's my profit. But what happens if this market opens up to competition and I'm charging $3 and another company comes in and it still costs $1 for them to make? Then they'll say, well, I'll charge $2.50. And then you say, well, you do $2.50, I'll do $2. So this competitive thing starts. And then the end, the long run equilibrium again, is where the price is equal to, in this case, assuming no fixed cost, marginal cost and average dollar cost, $1. So down here. And so I'll show you the other graph. This one with increasing margin. Actually, I'll show this one. So this one, it shows you what happens in the case of competition. In the case of competition, you will have all this. This is the demand, right? This is the price. Competition drives it down here at this quantity of competition and at the price equal to the marginal cost, average dollar cost. So very good for consumers. You get the most amount consistent with the cost of making it and the demand for the product. But once it becomes a monopoly, then their marginal revenue is not anymore equal to the marginal cost or the price because of competition. So they have this marginal revenue. They control the entire market. So now they'll make this amount here, say 500, and they'll charge the price here, which is above the marginal cost because they can, and that's how they maximize profit. So you can see the inefficiency here of all this chunk of big consumer surplus is taken some by the producer surplus, which is the profit, some remain to the consumers, much less, and then you have this thing, because this part doesn't exist anymore, is not produced anymore, that's a deadweight loss. So that's the inefficiency in the market of the existence of a monopoly. That's why governments don't want monopoly, and that's why in a case like this, in which the marginal cost actually would be constant like this or decreasing, means it's more efficient for one firm to produce everything. And so one firm, if let by itself, will charge this price here and make only 500. But the government will say, no, you can only have reasonable profit. So you have to be close to down here. You want to have a price close to 1 and serve as many people as possible. And that's why sometimes things are run by the government, like in some public transportations, they're run by the government. And in case of utilities, they are regulated by the government. Okay, and in some cases like medications where the companies basically can do what they want, but it's for limited amount of time, and that's kind of to compensate for the cost of R&D for coming up with new medication and to foster competition in a different way. Okay, so that's the main idea. Now I want to show you one last thing, and the last thing here is next week again you have the final exam. And the final exam will ask you to, the free response will ask you to address 2 questions. One question has to do with externalities, and the other question has to do with monopoly versus competition. And again, you choose one. Here again is a document, a Word document with 2 sample questions. So last week we looked at externalities, and you can use the problem with externalities, which is the second one here, as an example, and you can look at that as well the answer. This week, you have a problem with a monopoly in which you have a cost function for the company, and its fixed marginal cost is constant. In this case, it would be $2. You have a demand curve from which you can derive the marginal revenue. There's a YouTube video here on how to derive the marginal revenue. You can do stuff like that, right? And then so you want to find out the 2 outcomes. The outcome that it happens if the market is a monopoly because of the marginal cost, marginal revenue, profit maximizing point, and if it's a competitive outcome. So with the equations, you will have the similar example. You will have this outcome here. This is the demand. This is the marginal cost, which is equal to average dollar cost, assuming no fixed cost, which is 2. Okay. If you're a monopolist, you have a marginal revenue equals to that. I maximize the marginal cost equals marginal revenue right here. So I'll make 4 units and charge 6. because that gives me the most profit. You can try any other combination, any other price and quantity on the demand and the cost, considering cost, you will not have more profit than that. Okay, that's simply mathematical, given the demand and given the cost of production. And if you open up the competition, then somebody else comes in and say, you are selling for 6, I'll sell it for 5, 4, and then the competition starts, and the process will end up here at the price to 2, and the quantity will be 8. So in this example, you want to learn to understand why monopolies are inefficient. They're inefficient because of this control of the market and lack of competition. And that's why, because economists, on the government level economists, we care a lot about efficiency, and for consumers in general, that's why certain regulations exist. There are the arguments, well, whatever happens to the market, let the market work, but this is not an efficient market. So we like markets, but when they're efficient, and efficient only happens in terms of fair competition. Okay, so that's the main idea of the chapter. It's very cool. They're very cool chapters, 11 and 12, but 12 is really important because for you as, if you are in business, then you have to understand how to operate if your company deals with a more monopolistic market, but also as a citizen, you want to understand why monopolies are bad and learn to recognize when that happens and what the negative outcomes could be. Okay, so that's it for this chapter. I will now stop the recording and I will see you next week. Again, email me if you have questions. I'm happy to do Zooms. I've done a couple of times with students. I try to answer as fast as possible. So do all the stuff that you need to do. The end is near. And so I will stop the recording and I'll see you next week.